Good. Well, a very warm welcome to our first seminar of the IHR Modern German History Seminar Series in 2020-21. And it's the first time that we are online. So that's exciting because it offers so many new opportunities. And I could see that many colleagues also from the US and from Germany have dialed in, something that usually we're not able to do because we are quite the local operation otherwise. So I'd like to briefly introduce the context in which we are meeting today. The Institute of Historical Research is the UK's National Centre for History and is dedicated to supporting historians of all kinds. Aside from a wide array of historical projects, it offers a platform for engagement between scholars and the public about historical research in all its diversity and richness. And this has taken the shape, among others, in field-specific seminars like ours today. So the German Modern History Seminar is convened by a group of London-based historians, and it meets 6 times a year during the British academic year. And we accept paper proposals from historians at all career stages and especially welcome doctoral projects at an advanced stage. So please get in touch with us if you are interested in presenting, especially now that we're digital, we can actually accept proposals from around the globe. And our program is usually planned in the early months of the summer. So to be in touch in spring is usually a good way to, get a place on the schedule. And the program for this year can be found here. I'm going to put it into the chat. Oops, not in the waiting room, but to everyone in the meeting. So here you have it. At the minute, only the events for this semester are up, but we will update it also for the next semester. And I just wanted to briefly show you what we have planned for the entire year. So I'm going to share my screen. And there you have an overview of the events that are planned. Obviously today we have our panel event, and then we have individual papers, one in October with Mariusz Ostrowski, then a PhD student from University of St. Andrews, Percy Leung, is presenting in November, followed by a German colleague, Olga Sparschuh, in January. And then we have our joint lecture with the German Historical Institute here in London, which other than our normal meeting time is Wednesdays like today, but that is usually on a Thursday. So there we are very honored to also welcome Patrice Potus to talk about his research on migration and asylum. And then we finish off our series this year with Martina Kessel in March. So everybody is obviously invited. If you'd like to receive information on these events or reminders, please drop me a message in the chat and I can add you to our mailing list. So that would be wonderful to hear from you. And I will stop sharing my screen. Not pause, but stop. Okay, here we go. And I will just end on the note that, of course, as you can have already experienced with us, this is our first seminar meeting in an online setting, and we just hope that you will be patient with us and with each other as we are dealing with this new virtual way of engaging in the exchange of ideas. For the session, please keep your microphone muted during the panel, and if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. You can do that throughout the panel. I'll be collecting questions, and then there will be about 30 minutes at the end of the event for Q&A when I will put your questions forward to the speakers. I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed to make this event happen and help with advertising it, especially Age Black Europe. Our moderator today is Jeff Bowersox, who's Associate Professor in the School of European Language, Culture and Society at UCL. And he's also one of the conveners of the Modern German History Seminar. Jeff's research focuses on the cultural history of modern European colonialism, race in modern German history, and Black Germans as part of the African diaspora in Europe. And among many publications, he is the author of Raising Germans in the Age of Empire, Using Colonial Culture, 1871 to 1814, which came out with Oxford University Press. A very special thanks to our 4 panelists, Kira Thurman, Philipp Koepsell, Tiffany Florvil, and Robbie Aitken. And Robbie has been a wonderful co-organizer for this event, so I'd like to give the word to him now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katrien, and apologies, I've been having a bit of a Zoom nightmare for the last half an hour, but I am now here. I'm not going to delay us too much, but there are a few people I'd also like to just very quickly thank. Firstly, thanks to you, Katrien, for initiating this discussion and for organizing the event. I'm really glad that it's going to happen. Thanks, of course, to the IHR for supporting and promoting the event, for showing this interest in Black German studies. I think all of us in the panel are really grateful for the support. I personally am absolutely delighted that Philipp, Tiffany, Kira, Jeff, you're all here. We're in the same place at the same time. We've managed to do it. That's fantastic. And lastly, but certainly not least, thanks to all of you who've given up your time to be here with us. We had originally, as we were planning this, wondered whether it might just be the 6 of us sitting around having a private conversation and twiddling our thumbs. So we were truly astonished by the number of registrations. Don't let anyone ever tell you that there's no interest in Black German studies and Black history. Tonight's event is absolutely testimony to the exact opposite. So thank you everyone for being here. And I think, Katrien, do I now hand over to Jeff?
That's right. Thank you very much, Robbie. And thank you as well to everyone who's on the panel. It's fantastic to be here. And also thank you to everyone, as Robbie, let me just second that. So my role is going to be to facilitate discussion among our esteemed panelists and to help make sure the questions, that we get the questions together, as Katrien mentioned, to guide it along ways that are interesting and informative to all of you who have come. We have some set questions that we can follow. If your questions take us in another direction, that's fine. So please do send them in, as Katrien mentioned. Let me start just by doing very quick introductions. Robbie Aitken, who just spoke, is a reader in history at Sheffield Hallam. He's a specialist on the African diaspora in Europe and German colonial history. He's perhaps best known as the author with Eve Rosenhaft of Black Germany, The Making and Unmaking of a Diaspora Community, 1884 to 1914. And he's currently working on Black experiences under the Nazis and efforts after 1945 to claim compensation for the suffering that they endured during that time. Tiffany Florvil is Associate Professor of History at University of New Mexico, where she works on gender, sexuality, emotion, and activism in transnational exchanges, and specifically how they relate to the Black German movement of the 1980s and 1990s, which is the subject of her very recent book entitled Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of a Transnational Movement. And I should also note that she's the organizer of multiple workshops in Black German studies and edited collections, and one of the founders of Age Black Europe. And so Tiffany's been instrumental in creating institutional links and networks to facilitate study in these areas. Philipp Khabo Koepsell is a writer and a scholar and an activist and a poet and a playwright and an archivist and lots of other things too, based in Berlin. Among the things he's done most recently, he's overseen the production of publications like the Erste Ingabe Schwarze Kulturschaffende in Deutschland and the Afro-European Contemporary, which are works that sort of explore past and present Black German artistic production. He's also centrally involved with the Each One Teach One community project and education program in Berlin, EOTO, which you should check out. This is a program that's organized around empowerment activities and a comprehensive archive of Black German writing and activism that really needs use. So if you're looking for projects, it's there in Berlin. right there embedding. And then finally, we have Kira Thurman, who's assistant professor of history and German at the University of Michigan. She works on music and national identity in Germany and the intersections of these with the Black diaspora, among other things. She has a recent article in the New Yorker on Marian Anderson that I strongly encourage you to read because it's fantastic. And her forthcoming book is entitled Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. So these are our commentators for today. And I'm going to start just by offering a very simple introductory question. I'll ask just for very quick responses if we could. What was your path into the field of Black German studies? Perhaps we could start by maybe working backwards alphabetically. So maybe, Kira, would you mind starting?
Sure. And before I do, thank you to Katrin, thank you to Robbie and Jeff and everybody for organizing this. This is an amazing event. I'm still kind of a little shocked at how many people are here. So, so my foray into Black German studies is, and Black German history, which I think we will talk about perhaps that distinction a little bit at some point, is in graduate school. My second year of graduate school in my PhD program in history, I took a course actually in the German department, not in the history department, which again, I think is important to point out. And the class in the German department was on communities of color in Germany. And I didn't even know what the phrase communities of color meant at the time. And so I was just so intrigued by this course focusing on race and ethnicity. And then when I got into it, taught by the wonderful, lovely Beverly Weber at the University of Colorado, Boulder, that's when I discovered sort of through her, or, Afro-German history and sort of the stories of different Black Germans. The irony here, I should say, is that I grew up in Vienna, Austria, and I had no idea that this was an actual area of study or an area of research. I had studied piano performance for my bachelor's degree in music, so I'm a classically trained pianist. I switched over to history for my PhD program, and I was planning to write about, frankly, probably German Romanticism and E.T.A. Hoffmann and things like that in the sort of the 19th century. And it was in taking this course in my second year that I discovered that I could research and think about sort of Blackness in a German context, which I hadn't encountered before. So I'll stop there.
Philipp, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I guess I kind of slipped into it. I studied African studies at Humboldt University. That was my bachelor's. But during that time, I was on stage performing, writing poetry, doing all sorts of like arts projects. And most of them were really in the Afro-German community, were meant by and for this community. So it was kind of natural to deal with these issues and sort of like to go deeper into the history of Black people in Germany around that time. And it took a bit. I was working on this book project, Arriving in the Future, which is basically just an anthology of Black German poetry in English, by the way. But I was working on that, and my co-author and I, we had this discussion about like how we need to write an introduction on the history of Black people in Germany, the history of publication in Germany. And I was always wondering, like, there has to be something more than just this general narrative of Audre Lorde came in the mid-'80s and invented Black Germans. And I was always wondering, like, why isn't there anything? And I found out like the only reason is like no one ever looked at it. And so that's how I started getting into it. It was just pure interest and spite, to be honest. That's not flattering, but still, I wanted to prove people wrong, to say like, oh, there was activism, there were publications, there were people before that, and they were producing their stuff, And so that's how I got into it. And yeah, and everything else. I mean, each one teach one definitely helps. The archive that we built there, the library that we built there, the youth programs that we have there. Then I was a dramaturg at Ballhaus Straße, the theater. Everything there just drew me closer to that. So it's pretty much my life right now. It's not an academic life per se, but it's more like, I want to say that's how we live our lives. That's how we make our money currently. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. We're getting a sort of a theme of absences and silences that need to be filled, and not because they're empty, but just because we're not listening to them, I think, in some level.
Yeah.
Tiffany.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I also want to say thank you to Catherine and Robbie and Jeff for organizing this. It's a great, much like here, I'm like, wow, many people are here to hear us share our thoughts about Black Lives Matter in Germany. So I was an exchange student in Germany. I initially had a German pen pal. So my initial connection to Germany was a German pen pal. And I was an exchange student in high school. So after high school, I lived with a host family in Hamburg and had all of these really interesting racialized experiences in Germany. And so, from, the N-word to, presumptions that I was helping to sell drugs in Hamburg, a variety of, stereotypes that I was just like, I kept being struck by the fact that like the narrative of Germany was like, it's progressive and not racist, but then my experiences were counter to that. And so so I came to Germany too, not really speaking the language. So I learned the language in the year, went to gymnasium, also had to like take, I decided to take like fifth grade German, so I could like learn the Grammatik and all of that stuff. And so, but all of my racialized experiences just kept, compelling me to learn more about the African diaspora in the German context. And so when I left Germany and decided to go back to the US, I was intrigued by learning about Afro-Germans and how they were constituted a really dynamic community within the African diaspora. And I was sort of struck by that too, because my own sort of heritage, so both of my parents are from the Caribbean, so that is also a different sort of engagement with the diaspora. And I live in the US. So I'm sort of drawn to the sort of interesting narratives and experiences of the African diaspora. And so that exchange year really sort of pushed me to say, okay, I want to study this. And it certainly wasn't an easy process to pursue, especially in the sort of US context where people are like, who are these people? Why do you want to study them? Are you sure you want to study them? What are the numbers? Where you're like, why? And so a variety of questions kept coming up in which, people were reluctant were very reluctant. And I was like, whatever, I'm going to do it anyway. See ya. So that's my narrative.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. And Robbie.
So I guess my story is a little bit convoluted, but I'll try and keep to the short version. I was always interested in German history, and at school in Scotland, you either did for history the Great Reform Act of 1832 in England, or you did the Tragedy of Weimar. Needless to say, I was more drawn to the latter. So when I went to university, I tried to focus in on modules about German history. After I qualified, I wanted to do a PhD on Weimar. I wasn't quite sure what to do, but I was fortunate that my supervisor at the time, Eve Rosenhaft, had been in the German archives and had discovered a small note on police reports about communist demonstrations in 1930 and 1931, which made note that there was a Black political speaker. She said, go find more. At the same time, I had found an article in the Times of London about two Cameroonian men who had forged British £5 notes in Berlin. And the report in the Times suggested that the courtroom was full of people of color. So these two incidents threw up really interesting questions for me. Who were these people? What were they doing in Germany? And was this packed courtroom signs of a wider community? I'll have to be honest, in the late 90s, I didn't get anywhere fast. But I was aided and I'd say inspired by the work of Katharina Augentreuer. Her master's thesis, an Afro-Deutsche Geschichte, an African-German history, I think had been published the year after I started my PhD, so 97. And her thesis was this amazing biography of Mandenga Dik, a Cameroonian man who'd lived in Hamburg pre-1914, moved to Danzig, Gdansk, and set up a life, had a family. And she set this micro-history of the Dik family against the much larger backdrop of changes in German history. It sounds incredibly naive, but at the time her work completely challenged my whole understanding of not simply what German history is, was, and could be, but actually what European history is in general. Whose voices you hear, whose voices you don't hear. I'd spent all this time at school and at university studying German history, but here was a German history I knew absolutely nothing about. I'd have to admit my German language skills were pretty minimal, so I'd sit there in the library until way into the night with a dictionary in one hand, Augenteuer's book in front of me in the other, literally reading maybe a page every hour, but I was gripped. It was fascinating, exciting stories, and I couldn't let go of them. My PhD went in a completely different direction, but once I finished at the beginning of the 2000s, I tried to return to the questions and avenues that Augenteuer opened up. And that's really what I've been trying to do for the last 17, 18 years.
Thank you for that, Robbie, and everyone. It seems like this theme you just mentioned, Robbie, about developing not just a curiosity, but actually having a different sense of, or having this challenge our ideas of what it means to do German or European history. I think it's something that runs through all of our experiences, and I think all through our work, our research, and our creative work. So I wonder maybe we can pick up that theme a little bit and talk about that. As Kara mentioned, we're interested in learning more about what it means to do Black German history specifically, and the title of this panel is Black Lives Matter in German History. So perhaps we could talk about that a little bit, picking up on Robbie's theme. What does it mean to do Black German history, and why does it matter? How does it contribute to our understanding in some way that's perhaps not widely known, or perhaps should be better known, either way? And I'm just happy for any of you to go ahead and jump in. Kara?
I mean, because I'm the one that brought it up, I should probably answer my own question. But, and this is not at all to somehow dismiss Black German studies, right? Which I am incredibly indebted to and grateful for. That it seems like the way in which scholarship on Blackness in Germany developed for a long time was in German studies, perhaps more so than in German history. When I think about people like Sarah Lennox at UMass Amherst, sort of helping to establish in the United States a sort of continual Black German focus. And perhaps other scholars like Fatima El-Tayeb, although she trained as a historian. But then sort of ended up more in sort of regional studies, ethnic studies, things like that. That a lot of the first scholarship that I read was in the field of German studies, perhaps over German history. And so what does it mean to be doing history, I think, is a really great question. I mean, I think, of course, for historians, oftentimes our bread and butter is, change over time, continuity, rupture, these kinds of things, and that we can sort of use the historian's toolkit and apply it to sort of bring it to Black German studies, to bring it to these conversations that have been established for a long time on Blackness in Germany. I can get into more thoughts on that later, but I'll sort of let other people chime in as well. I'm being mindful of the time.
Yeah, Robbie?
In a way, I'd quite like to free Black German studies from the straitjacket that is German history, because to my mind, it's about so much more than this. There's so many German historians want to dismiss this as being important, but I think the histories of Black people in Germany contribute to multiple different transnational histories. They're partly about the history of multiple African states. I know in all the times I've been to Cameroon, this is for them very much a shared history. They contribute to the history of the United States, the history of the Caribbean, South America, the history of empire and anti-empire, the history of the Black International and the development of a global Black diasporic consciousness. So I think in many ways, seeing this as just simply part of German history misses out on the bigger points to which actually these stories contribute. Of course, they can help us understand more about Weimar culture, about the history of race and the history of the Nazi regime. But I think that really acts as a limiting break on the transnational perspectives that the stories of these Black men and women, these pioneers, really can tell us about.
Oh, sorry, Philip.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go.
Go ahead,
Yeah, I agree with Robbie. I think that I see the distinction in terms of seeing Black German studies and Black German history. And, you know, a lot of these earlier sort of scholars here in the US, like Leroy Hopkins, Sarah Lennox, and the like, were sort of Germanists who were studying, you know, German literature. And so I feel like it had a natural home. German studies has had a natural home in those spaces. But I feel like Black German history is also quite interdisciplinary. It intersects with transnational movements, empire, colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonial thought. And so I think that I see the significance of a shift in terms of really sort of understanding these ideas about racialization, in which you can sort of use Black German history as a way of sort of processing different stages of racialization, movement, what constitutes identity. And for me, for my own work, you know, these issues of belonging and sort of the whiteness as an organizing principle in the German context, and how that's shifted across a variety of spaces and also chronologies. So I see the utility in both having, you know, Black German history as well as Black German studies. And I think many of these works that are in the fields are very cross-disciplinary. So they're not only focusing on sort of change over time, but they're also analyzing ideas about Blackness. They're analyzing those connections. And so I think that's all very, very useful in this sort of larger understanding of Black German history.
Philipp.
Yeah, from a very practical standpoint, I see these events that we have at Each One Teach One at times, where it's like a literature event, or whether it's about social justice, and you still have the same people that we invite are the people who we were to focus on if we were to look at Black German history. So, for instance, we have this panel with Katharina Gontoye. So we might talk about something that is socially relevant right now at this point, but she also occupies her own personal spot in the history of Black people in Germany. And I keep seeing this all over the place. So I can't distinguish between like, from my practical standpoint, between Black German studies and Black German history, because it is both the very same thing. So whether we're talking about having this thing called the Afro census right now, so sort of like the census of, I don't know, Black people in Germany. This thing has been happening like 20 years ago. There was another initiative with the same idea. So and whether it's having a Black artist movement, I can pull out the documents of the last Black artist movement EV that happened in 1993 or 1992 or before that. So for me, it's a continuation of activism, whether it's now or whether it's 20, 30, or 40 years ago. These people might even still be alive. We have talked about something called the Black Information Center, which was a cultural center in Schöneberg in Berlin in 1970, built up by in Black XGI in Germany. I found the guy who was running. I found the night manager of that thing, of this institution, of this cultural center, back in 1970. He's still here in 2020. He's an R&B singer in an R&B quintet. So these guys still exist. It's a continuation of things, and it is the same on the level of activism that we have now. It's the same thing as the level of activism that we had 20 years ago. So I can't, for the life of me, I can't make a difference. For me, it's all very much rooted in the history of activism, of publication, of all of that. So I personally can't make the difference.
Let me pick up on that. Oh, go ahead, Philip. Sorry, finish.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I wanted to pick up on the point you just raised about the sort of political stakes in this, because the question of what Black German history has to offer, why it should matter, within the broader field of German history or beyond, as Robbie noted. It sort of has two elements in my mind. On the one hand, there are the sort of political implications in the present, which is certainly what Philipp's talking about, as well as its sort of legacies. But then there's also the sort of historiographic academic stakes for incorporating these ideas, these subjects, approaches, and voices into our existing narratives as we understand them and how it changes our research, perhaps. Because what struck me out of the introductory stories is that a lot of the sort of, it required a different sort of approach to even knowing what sort of sources are available that's led into this. Not like it was, we were trained to do this, right? So I'm wondering if the panelists would mind thinking about or talking about either the sort of political implications in the present of doing this sort of work, or, and they're probably connected, but or the sort of historiographic implications of this for how we think about and research German history. And feel free to take up any aspect of that and take it in whatever direction you may like.
I think certainly for me, Black German history is part of a larger project of blackening European history, of challenging these dominant narratives, as you said, Jeff, that ignore or silence or just simply render passive the active role that Black people have played in Germany. And at the same time, I think the contemporary political stakes are that making visible this longer historical Black presence should serve to render obsolete that persistent notion that Germanness and Blackness are two mutually exclusive categories or mutually exclusive identities. And were I to paraphrase Sarah Lennox, I think this work also helps to de-provincialize Germany, to demonstrate that kind of historical and contemporary interconnectedness that Germany has with the wider world, and the impact, the influence of the wider world has had on Germany and constructions of a German identity. So the history is always, to my mind, going to have a relevance on the contemporary situation. It feels very much to me that for many people, a Black German population starts in 1945 when American GIs start to occupy parts of Western Germany, but that's clearly not the case. There's plenty of research to show that you can take this back, really almost back to the Roman time period. So it's about normalizing that Black presence within these historical and contemporary narratives.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Black German studies / history is so integral to how we see and define Europe. We oftentimes see Europe as a very sort of homogenous and multicultural space, and clearly we know that it's not. And so Black German studies / history allows us to interrogate the different meanings of race, the different categorizations of difference, how migration works, how issues of, how do we construct a national polity and what that means, who's excluded in the polity, who's included in the polity. Why does citizenship matter in moments? Why does citizenship matter, especially when we think about like the construction, sort of the construction of Fortress Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, and then sort of this now sort of the new instances of migration. So the sort of the space of the Mediterranean. So I think what Black German studies does is it really sort of really expands our understanding of what constitutes Europe. That Europe, the boundaries of Europe are actually more fluid than we recognize, that like European identity also takes root in the colonies, in terms of looking at how colonial subjects were not only subjugated, but used as a way of sort of fashioning a European identity that seemed to be in a contrast to indigenous populations. So I see it as being a very necessary tool in recognizing European notions of self, the collective self, as well as the individual self. And in notions of how difference is constructed in such a multi-layered way. And for my, I'm not teaching, so I don't teach like a Black German or Black European history class per se, but I integrate Black European and Black German studies in all of my classes. So literally by the end of the semesters, the students are like, okay, we get it. Race exists, Black people and people of color exist in Europe. Thank you, Dr. Florvil. We get it. It's not a homogenous or white space, and I think that's the significance of Black German studies, that it really adds to this richer narrative of European history.
to piggyback on that a little bit, and I won't sort of take too long. I think what I love about both Robbie and Tiffany's answers is that it's reminiscent to me of, and it's on my mind because I taught this essay recently, Joan Scott's famous essay, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis, right? Where she argues it's not enough to simply say that women participated in the French Revolution, right? That doesn't change how we understand the French Revolution. Rather, the goal is to sort of think about how this category of gender is everywhere, right? And to think about it as a social process, to think about it in relation to power. And I think what I love about both Robbie and Tiffany's answers is that it's suggesting the same thing. It's not enough to simply say, let's include, a Black person into the unit. It's more like, how can we use Black German history, Black German studies to rethink or think through some of the most established categories that we have for talking about sort of German history and European history and global history as well.
And I think it's worth thinking about when we do that process. I think another thing that comes out of that is that we not only do we rethink them, but we also, I think, get a different perspective on how those assumptions came to be in the first place, that we get a different perspective on the processes by which that erasure happened. Because in those past periods, people knew, right? Contemporaries knew that there were Black people around, and there were discourses and conversations about this. And yet the fact of that presence was not just forgotten, it was actively erased. And that those processes reveal operations of power that have legacies, into the present. As I think we know from our own various careers and how we teach, and the sort of resistance that we variously faced in doing this work and presenting it in various contexts. So we got a couple of questions. There was a first one from Miriam Brucius, who had a question for Tiffany, but says that anyone can certainly be welcome to answer. She asks, coming from the US, where Black activism and Black history has a different standing, how did you navigate your own role in pushing this field forward, and how strange or not was it to study Black Germans elsewhere with a different diasporic history than your own? Did you find yourself looking for shared experiences, shared concerns and similarities, or rather differences, to stress the heterogeneity and locality of these histories, or both? So this is a question about I think our sort of Tiffany's engagement in the diaspora and the personal stakes, which will be different for all of us doing this sort of work.
I guess there's a sort of interesting layers. I haven't found it difficult to pursue the study of Black German history / whatever we want to call it for today. I think mostly because the diaspora has been always inherently transnational and never a static group of people. So I see it always, I feel like, Stuart Hall's, comment about the diaspora being both, commonalities and differences, inherent differences, and how that's shapes a diasporic identity. I think that's been sort of undergirding my approach to Black German studies. And I think I'm drawn to larger narratives of Black Europe through Black Germany because of these differences and distinctions, so that they can simultaneously have parallels, but also be, terribly different in ways. And so I think I'm really drawn to that sort of complexity. And I think it helped that, it's sort of an interesting story, and I'll try to sort of keep it short, that when I went to Germany, when I, experienced my, exchange year in Germany, it was literally my moment that I was like, oh yeah, I am Afro-Caribbean. Like it was like being away from my family, in which I recognized that there were still certain cultural traits that I hadn't, that were so normalized for me that I didn't realize, that I was like, oh yeah, I'm Afro-Caribbean. We have different foods, we have different practices, we have different habits. And that was abundantly clear to me, even more so in Germany. And so I see that as sort of guiding my research too, that of course the diaspora is inherently different. What's interesting about it is what it tells us about power relations, what it tells us about knowledge, especially when we think about Black German movement of the sort of 80s and 90s, really about sort of excavating the past, decolonizing knowledge, and then what it tells us about identity and belonging, how they expand notions of belonging and also expand notions of citizenship, not necessarily tethering it to the nation alone. So I think that, I hope that sort of answers your question a little, Miriam.
I'm happy to take that in a direction. Does anyone want to contribute or build on what Tiffany said or comment? No, because something that you said, Tiffany, about the sort of the tensions and the differences ties to another question that I see coming up. In fact, a couple of them about Black Germanness as a stable identity and who gets to define that. But also the question from Lisa about the need for identity studies departments at German universities. And this makes me think of a broader question that we had talked about talking about, which was the sort of institutional sort of possibilities for doing the sort of work that we're doing. You know, where we are, you know, how does that make it possible to do the work? You know, what about your position either within the academy or in a particular country or in a particular place or a particular style of university or outside the academy altogether? You know, how does your location allow you to do this sort of work in the way that I think Kira mentioned, you know, Kira brought up Fatin Al-Tayeb and others in the US, where this work is easier to do. And the reason I asked, this is very circular, but the reason I asked is because I've been party to debates where the sort of different possibilities of doing this work, the institutional possibilities, the access to stable, secure academic positions, is one example of this, means that people in certain places like the US can do this work while people in other places, say most of continental Europe, have a hard time doing this work. And this also colors the scholarship, right? It shapes how the models people impose and try to use and the sorts of voices that get raised and so on. And there's a lot of complicated power relations within all of that. So that's a very long and roundabout way of saying, could you guys maybe talk about what it means to be doing this work where you are and how possible is it? And how can you speak to maybe, since we're all Germanists, how does this relate to what's possible from your experiences within, say, the German Academy?
I guess if I can go, and I will again try to keep my comments brief. I was so struck by a couple years ago learning that Fatima El-Tayeb's book Schwarze Deutsche, what is it? Ein Diskurs Rasse zwischen 1800 etwas in 1933. But I'm forgetting the title. But when she published a book in 2001, it was the third book ever published on the history of Black people in Germany, right? And then thinking since then, what I've noticed as well, and also it's so interesting that she now has a permanent position and is well established within American sort of academia. She's at UC San Diego. You know, and so thinking after that, when I think about the single authored monographs that deal with sort of the history of Black people in Germany, yeah, the majority of them seem to be coming from the States. You know, of course, there are exceptions, I think, within, like, well, Robbie's here and Jeff's here, right? So there are definitely some exceptions, but like when thinking about that, you know, and so, and I understand, you know, that in a lot of ways within an American context, the fact that there were established sort of African-American studies programs and Black studies programs going back to the 1960s and 70s has perhaps sort of helped to make the research within the U.S. academic system possible. I think about what is it, Robin Kelly's essay, but a local phase of a global problem, right? About sort of you know, that Black American history, he argues, has always been international. It's always been outward facing. It's always been sort of looking beyond America's shores. So I think there are certain, I think you can recognize, or we can recognize that, like, through the activism really of sort of Black Americans in the 1960s, sort of advocating for Black studies departments, African-American studies departments, there's a somewhat sort of more, like, there are more established departments in the States that sort of then have allowed perhaps different scholars to work in this vein. Although I'm very eager to hear what sort of Tiffany, Philipp, and Robbie have to say otherwise. A quick thing about Black German, yes, of course, this is not a stable category. Like, no, I mean, this is not a stable category. I think the way I oftentimes think about it is I'm looking for people of African descent on German soil. But actually, it not being a stable category is what makes it exciting. And this is how Michelle Wright sees it in particular, who wrote her first book, Becoming Black, her second book, Physics of Blackness. you know, where to her mind, it's what, and also this is what makes the German speaking world so different from, say, France or England, is that there are many ways in which people of African descent end up in Germany, right? It's not just through the colony and the metropole relationship, although of course that's there too. But then of course there are the stories of African American soldiers, there are West African students coming to study. You know, this, I'm only talking about a 20th century context. I'm not even talking about 19th or 18th, you know, or things like that. So no, it is not a stable category, but that's precisely, to my mind, what makes it exciting.
Would any of the others of you like to pick up on the question Kira's raised about the sorts of experiences and the sort of tensions, the institutional workings?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly tensions. I think that there, you know, it has been a problem in terms of thinking about what Tina Camp refers to as like diasporic asymmetries, in which there's sort of, you know, a US dominated perspective on Black German studies. And that sort of still seems to be the case in some perspectives, especially because we have that legacy of, you know, this sort of post-1968 legacy of like ethnic studies, gender studies programs, which help to facilitate this type of work in the US context. And then of course is, you know, helping to facilitate Black German studies. So I certainly think that that still exists. And I think it's institutionally in terms of sort of Black German studies in Germany, oftentimes you have these individuals like Philipp, like Peggy Pisha, like you know, Maisha Eggers or Katja Kinder, or you know, Katharina Oguntoya, all of these individuals who I do think are intellectuals and who are activists are not connected to institutions, to academic institutions in Germany. And that's due to structural racism and a variety of other things going on in terms of the German context. So I think that has been the problem too, that like those individuals, you know, who are, you know, I'm not naming a variety of others, they are producing knowledge and that's oftentimes ignored in sort of academic settings. And so this is why spaces like Each One Teach One, this is why the Afro Census is important, this is why, you know, Black History Month, all of these events are a way to sort of decolonize knowledge in the German context. So they don't have they don't necessarily have a, you know, an academic institution, although Maisha does. She's at like visiting professor at the Humboldt University. And I think that Peggy is also affiliated with like the Humboldt Stiftung. So I think there's something there, but there's still such a lack of institutional development in the German context. I think in the British context, you do have a legacy of Black British Panthers. You do have that legacy that's helping with the diasporic knowledge production and like circulation. And then you do have some, you know, avenues to sort of study that. Like you also have like LSE, you have all of these sort of institutions that are studying, you know, that are sort of prominent in terms of African studies. But that is still few and far between in both contexts. And the number of like BAM intellectuals in England is like, you know, less than 30. And then the number of, you know, intellectuals of color who are in German institutions is also less than, I would say less than 10. So that says a lot about these European structures. And so I'll stop there.
Yeah, Robbie.
I think, Tiffany, a lot of the comments you made about the situation in Germany and the fact that many activist academics are outside of the university system holds, for me, very much true in the British context. I think most of the cutting edge work up until very recently has been carried out with universities. I know there are recent initiatives, you know, Birmingham City, De Montfort, Bristol, Goldsmiths, etc. But Black studies as a thing, to my mind, doesn't exist in the same way that it does in the US, certainly not outside of literature departments. So I think it's very difficult to find that institutional support, which is crucial to be able to carry out this kind of research in the first place. It's very difficult to position yourself. I know when I was starting out, I do German history, but I'm not a typical German historian. I don't cover the hits that people want to hear and see at university. I like African history and I do African history, but I'm not an Africanist. So you find yourself in many ways caught between two stools. And if you're trying to then pitch a project or find a job, that's exceedingly difficult. And I do think we're a long way off getting to that position in the United States where you can carry out this type of work. And as you said, Tiffany, and I think Philipp, I'm sure will agree, I feel it's a similar situation in Germany as well.
Yeah, Philipp.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you and Tiffany as well. I mean, one thing is the funding situation to get something to build something up that is big enough to be recognized internationally, and another thing is the situation of being recognized from the academic standpoint, because there, regardless of what we do, is if it doesn't come with a title, if it doesn't come with a university off, then no one really cares. I mean, unless we become like subjects of the study, and that is pretty much the situation right now. If we build enough, if we have our archives and we show the public that we have all this knowledge there, then there's the academic interest, and after the academic interest comes sort of like it's legitimate enough to have a standing as an archive or as an history project, you know, on Black German history, for instance. But coming from the grassroots situation by itself, it's not enough. We always need it needs to be bounced back from the outside. As soon as we take this particular project to, let's say, New York, wherever, you know, then we get the attention, and we get the academic attention, and then it's regarded as something legitimate. But other than that, no. I mean, you will really have to go to the academic ways to get something done. From a grassroots movement or point of view, really, really difficult. Yeah.
So Kira and then Katrine.
Oh, sorry. I think just one thing that we talked about last time that I wanted to bring in is how much this is a cyclical kind of process, right? That what it seems like has happened is the ways in which sort of Black people have, in a German context specifically, sort of never been welcomed into the academy. And then the academy sort of declares this kind of research then not rigorous, you know, because it only exists outside of an academic context. And then because it only exists outside of an academic context, you know, they're not going to then be receptive, right, to sort of these kinds of histories. It's like, it's a chicken and the egg type situation, it feels like sometimes, of like, you know, the academy doesn't welcome it per se. So then people find a way to make it work otherwise. But then that kind of knowledge then isn't in turn recognized by the academy. It just, you know, it can feel like it can go in a circle over and over again.
Yes, and we do have a question from the audience here that might be quite fitting. That's for Philipp. And Sarah Colvin asks if your poetry as history, word of mouth and so on, this is mostly going out to different kinds of audience as performance. And she's wondering what kinds of questions and responses you get back. So now thinking about the non-academic context for a minute.
I mean, I guess the responses and questions, they're like most like very like on the private level of like, how do you identify in this? Because I always say like, okay, we talk about race in Germany, it's always an identity, it's always a negotiation of identity, really. So that's the same thing as like, how stable is the Black German identity? It's not stable, it's a negotiation. It really depends on how you see yourself in what particular context are you currently, and what is the time frame. Like for me, for instance, I'm South African German. When I'm in Germany, I can identify as Black German. I can identify as South African German. I can identify as, you know, whatever I like. In South Africa, it's a completely different thing. Don't even try to come with like Black as an identity. That is not for me. There are several other categories. So that is for instance one thing. How do you identify in this? Like, why do you keep writing these things? What is the negotiation of identity around this? Why what languages do you use? Why do you use these languages? For instance, is English more of a decolonial language? as opposed to German. It's like, no, I use languages interchangeably. They come up. I use it for this, I use it for that. So no, I don't see my poetry or the performance as something, let me see, as history, as the question is here, poetry as history. No, it's just my personal way of expressing myself. And I guess if it wasn't for poetry, it would be something different. And it is something different. It can be graphic design. It can be installations of some sort. I am an artist, period. And if you give me the tools, I will express myself. You know, that's pretty much it.
So I see we have a few questions now on different topics, on sort of more institutional things, sort of departmental and disciplinary type concerns, about practical sort of teaching of this, and then questions, sort of a more historical question, I suppose, about East-West divides. I think, and there was also a question about queer activism as well. I think those are the questions that remain as of yet unanswered. Let's see if we can get to all of those, as well as more that pop up if they're connected to it. I wonder if maybe we could start on, maybe we'll get to sort of some of these through this. But the question that Susan puts, she's teaching or running a BA major in transcultural studies in Dusseldorf with an introductory lecture series on Black Lives Matter. And she notes there are no Black people on her faculty. Some of her colleagues are reluctant to teach Black Lives Matter because we're all white. But if we don't teach it, our students won't get scholarly exposure to the complexity of the matter of Black lives. She asks how to deal with this. And maybe some of these other things will come in as we address this. Yeah, Kira?
I think there are a couple of different ways to deal with it. I'm going to sort of punt it back, perhaps. One, of course, is to think about different sources that are out there. The other actually is start talking to white scholars who are already teaching Black Lives Matter in different contexts, whether they're US-based scholars, whether there are sort of, British scholars, perhaps some German scholars as well, that the conversation you need to have is not necessarily with me. It's with white scholars who are doing this work already.
Yeah, I agree with Kira. And I mean, I think also, if you're already teaching, so for example, if you're teaching like Toni Morrison in class, like if you're teaching June Jordan, if you're teaching all of these other figures from the diaspora, why not also integrate stuff from Katrin Opentoya or Maya or Philipp, or, I mean, the list goes on. Second of all, it's also a question of, like, if you're teaching this in terms of the American context, if you're white teaching these subjects, what seems to be the reluctance about teaching it in the German context? So if you're already sort of engaging with it, what's the reluctance? And then also, yeah, getting in contact with colleagues who are teaching this, who are your white colleagues. And also, don't be ashamed or reticent to also engage with Black German activists and artists in Germany who can come in and give lectures, or to give offer sort of visual exhibition. So I think this is an opportunity to sort of expand the network of knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to shut.
No, I just wanted to make sure everyone knew. I just wanted to make a correction. Susan has been misunderstood. She wants us to know that she's been teaching this material. It's her colleagues who are resistant. So she's wondering how to deal with the colleagues who are resistant.
Yes, I mean, so if I can, I know, and I'm so sorry that you've been dealing with this. I don't think there's much you can do. I do not want a resistant colleague teaching Black studies. I don't. Right. So if they don't want to do the work, unfortunately for you, I don't see a way around it other than hiring. And you said there are no resources for your department. I think maybe turning to other departments, trying to figure out how to teach and collaborate with other units at your university is the way. But getting reluctant and possibly white colleagues to try to be on board for this is not the way to go.
Philipp, you had your hand up a second ago.
I mean, the simplest thing is just invite people who have the expertise. who have the knowledge about it. And I know so many of my colleagues that would be happy to go into classrooms, to go into universities, and just give like a 1 hour lecture on something. I understand you don't have to be the expert on it, but then get someone. And you don't have to pretend to know everything. I mean, the worst thing would be to sit in a class that is on Black Lives Matter, led by someone who just read up on it an hour ago or like a week ago, and who's trying to tell me about my life in Germany. So no, get someone who knows about it.
If I can also interject really quickly, because this I think is becoming more of an issue and more of a problem across German departments, both in the United States and elsewhere. It's sort of recognizing expertise, right? There was a letter a couple years ago in 2015 when Uni Bremen tried to start their own sort of Black Studies program, but didn't involve any Black scholars, didn't involve any Black faculty, and had white scholars with no training in this sort of now taking on this kind of work. And the problem with that is it diminishes our own scholarship, it diminishes our own work by sort of implying that anybody can do this and that it doesn't require expertise and that it doesn't require knowledge, right? Which is already the problem oftentimes in Black studies, is if what we're doing is considered not intellectually rigorous, this is not helping to sort of change that kind of messaging. So it's an ongoing conversation. This is just for, I've encountered it in different contexts this summer as well. And it's something I don't entirely know how to solve yet. And I do recognize, of course, that we want to integrate these materials into our courses. But as Philipp is saying, sort of recognize that there are scholars who have expertise and who have training in this field.
And just as a side note, I mean, one of the silver linings of all of the sort of lockdown disruption is that we've all gotten virtually connected. I mean, testament is everyone who's here. People can zoom in and offer expertise in a way that wasn't really possible or even conceived of, just a year ago. So that's an opportunity people should take up as is possible. On a related point, Jenny Watson asks, I'm wondering to what extent efforts to bring Black German studies into the academy, and this is in Germany, are hampered by an erroneous view that Black studies are an import, specifically a US import. And she uses the example of the Netherlands, where Black studies and liberation movements are dismissed as quote unquote Americans. So I think this is probably building on the same sort of theme. There's also a history to this as well. I'm not sure if the panelists would like to comment on this very, very particular sort of critique of Black studies, of teaching Black studies. The idea that Black studies is a specifically American thing and thus doesn't relate to Europe, or it's a foreign model.
Oh wait. So what was the critique again? That Black studies is American and
thus it doesn't need to be taught in, say, the Netherlands or Germany.
Yeah, there are so many great essays on this already. Alana Lenton, right, is sort of, I think, the first person perhaps people should be reading, who definitely smacks down this notion that sort of Black studies or thinking about race is sort of only in an American context. I don't think we need to rehash that here, but I think perhaps sort of reading Alana Lenton's work, who, like, again, she has a whole essay addressing just this, right, is probably the way to go.
Yeah, and Jenny follows up. She's wondering how current this thinking is and whether it's changing.
I think her essay's from like 2016.
Yeah.
So that feels pretty current to me.
And certainly that critique persists. I mean, outside the academy, certainly in discourses around whether racism exists or not. This sort of fits with ideas of, like Gloria Wecker writes about for the Netherlands, white innocence. And others have, Heide Fehrenbach has written about this in a West German context, about the idea that anti-Black racism is somehow not a German thing. And sort of the Federal Republic has those sorts of myths built into it from the start, that it's an American thing. And civil rights shows that it's an American thing. And because it's an American thing, we don't have to deal with it. Sort of the point that Fehrenbach makes. So this is a really old point, but I think it's still a persistent point in public discourse, at least looking at it as an American in Britain, looking at Germany from here. Let's see.
I mean, I might hijack things a little bit. I think there were some questions that got sort of buried a little bit. Atina asking about like how much is Black German studies tied perhaps to the push to decolonize German history, sort of, and I don't necessarily have an answer, but I suspect that Tiffany and Robbie do. And then Marianne Kaplan's question about thinking about distinctions between African Germans and Black Germans, and also thinking about like perhaps like Africanistic, you know, and its role perhaps in things. I'm curious to hear what other people say. I don't necessarily have like brilliant insights into this myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think Philipp mentioned it, that like oftentimes the 80s and 90s is associated with Audre Lorde, and which is like she's like couched as like the mother of the movement, which, you know, and you know, in many ways she was a really significant figure, but she wasn't the only figure. So they were connecting with a variety of other they had a toolkit of like diasporic resources, of which Lorde was one of many, in which they were able to use her, but they're also connecting with like South African artists, you know, Ghanaian artists, who all living in Berlin in the 1980s. And so I think there's a rich legacy in terms of the Audre Lorde, because she's also very significant in terms of sort of queer Black women, queer Black German women who see an openly powerful activist who's showing interest in them. But there are a variety of other diasporic resources that Black Germans have used. And I think that the sort of decolonizing push, I think we've seen this mostly outside of the academy in the earlier instances. So I think like efforts to decolonize German history were done on the ground. So grassroots activism to sort of really integrate notions about race, colonialism, the afterlives of German colonialism. I think the movement really helped to do this. So sort of, I'm talking about like the sort of movement of the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 90s. And then you have their push for like studies about colonialism, studies about racialization in the colonial period, the grandfather clause, and all of this. And so you see that those sort of earlier instances taking place outside of the academy, even though they're helping to shape the academy simultaneously as well. And then I think the sort of more sort of 20th century, 21st century push to decolonize knowledge is inherently a part of Black German studies. I think it's inherently a part of Black European studies more broadly, that these are the spaces where you're able to interrogate what types of knowledge is normalized, what notions of identity, European identity, whiteness, race, etc., are really need to be sort of recalibrated and reconsidered. So I'll just stop there.
Robbie or Philipp, would you like to say anything about the concept of decolonization? Either it could be very much sort of practical, or about the sort of conceptual notion of what constitutes decolonization. Philipp?
Yeah, currently we have a lot of programs that are designed to address this, whether it's from the Berlin Senate or from the different Berlin boroughs, really designed to address this void in the funding situation. But I think it's a political move. That was my daughter smashing something in the background. I think it's more of a political move to do that. And there's quite an amount of money right now in the game. And you can see how it's being offered to the different NGOs for different events, for different events. They're also used to appease the AfD, you know, sector of the political section. But at no point do I feel like it's really the intention is to look at Black German history, or to look at German colonialism and really work on this, but more to, you know, to take this lump sum of money, to give it to certain NGOs, so that we can prove for the next 4 years, for the next legislative term, that we have done something, especially, you know, since it's the UN decade for people of African descent. You know, all of these things, they play a role in it. And currently the situation is, as an NGO, find the program, write the project, get the money, get your things done. Don't think it's a moral, ethnical issue. No, it's just, get the funding, do it, because that's pretty much the situation. It's not. It's political. Yeah.
Robbie, then Katrine.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I think I'd agree with quite a lot of what you said. To my mind, the kind of recovering of Black German history predates this current decolonizing moment. The work that Owen Toya, Mayim, and others were carrying out is long before this. The decolonizing moment, with this money in the pots and the opportunities for NGOs, but also universities, I often feel that the focus is very much in the colonial history, but forgetting the fact that it's colonialism that helped create a stable Black community in Germany in the first place. So that's pushed to one side, and this kind of divergence. The decolonizing moment is really focusing on the colonial history, street names, statues, etc., but forgetting the Black lives that go along with it. So I have some issues with the way in which it's developing, if I'm honest.
Katrine?
Yeah, there's another question from the audience that might link up quite well, and that's from Claudia Growy, who asks for suggestions of ways that researchers and academics can provide more exposure or institutional access to members of grassroots movements such as Philipp, or at least use our scholarship in a way that is collaborative or useful to organizations and activists who are knowledge producers in their own right. So she's been reflecting a lot on the power relations of doing research and effective decolonial methodologies in this context. So if you are aware of any good ways of providing platforms for initiatives that might not just be those NGOs who write a quick project, but are grassroots within the academic context, Claudia would be interested.
I mean, I think one thing I can say really quickly is I'm going to toot all of our horns at once, which is that we're all involved in this project called blackcentraleurope.com, right? Which is a website that has historical documents that go back to at least the medieval era, sort of depicting and sort of showcasing different Black historical subjects and their words, their writings, and things like that. So, and that project came out of a place of us recognizing a huge sort of need in a lot of ways for to have a primary source repository or website where people could read these materials for themselves. Jeff, I think, is the manager for this project. He's done so much with it and making sure everything's available in both English and in German. And so, but it's definitely been one way in which we have tried to disseminate these materials to a broader audience that doesn't just stay in the ivory tower, so to speak.
And Jeff just put the link in the chat for everybody. Thank you, Jeff.
Sure, Robbie.
I think collaborations are very important, and I see increasingly opportunities to work with artists, activists, but I think they need to be organic. You need to find partners who actually want to work with you, rather than that kind of paternalistic sense that, we've got great research, we want to share it. It's a very difficult tightrope, I think, to travel. I have been fortunate that with time people have picked up on the research, and I was fortunate to work on Zurückgeschaut, the exhibition in Berlin Treptow about the 1896 colonial exhibition. But I'm always a little bit hesitant about trying to approach people. I think I'd far rather that connections are made coming from the other side first. I know that's not very helpful, but I do feel that the danger with a lot of collaborations is when they go wrong, when it's not clear what the boundaries are, when it's asymmetric. Black Central Europe, I can definitely give a big up to. I think the website's fantastic. So, Claudia, if you're interested in helping us with that, definitely get in touch.
Yeah, I'll also plug HBlack Europe, which is an HNet group that like Kira and I founded a couple years ago, or like I don't know, time is relative now, but so it's a space that we've had quite a bit of queries from pre-K pre-K teachers asking, how can I integrate this into my class? And then threads about, these are the sources I use in my class. This may be useful for you in your own class. So I think maybe sort of sending, queries. I think one of the projects that I'd like to pursue for H Black Europe is also a syllabus database on Black Europe, with H Black Germany class, German classes, Italian classes, anything that will allow us to sort of disseminate this material out to others so that they can see what what other people are doing in their classroom, and then try to integrate that. So that's a side project that I want to do, a variety that it's on the back burner now because we're in a pandemic and stuff has to wait. And I think it's much like Robbie, I love collaboration, but it has to come organically. And I think to genuinely do great work on Black Europe, you do have to collaborate. You have to sort of work with other people who have expertise in those regions that you're not familiar with. So I can't claim expertise on Black Europe. I can claim expertise in certain regions in Black Europe, but I can't claim expertise on like Black Portugal or Black Finland or Black Poland. And this is why it's necessary to work with scholars who are doing that work. And I think, I'm working on an edited volume on Black Europe that's trying to do just that. That's working with scholars who are focusing on the African diaspora in Portugal, in Poland, in Italy. And so I think it's really important to really expand your scholarly networks, and finding collaboration is useful, but it has to come organically, much like Robbie said.
Robbie?
Actually, one thing that did strike me that I find increasingly helpful in collaborations was working with schools. I've found an increasing number of schools in the UK where German history is absolutely a staple of the curriculum, that there are teachers who want to change the view that the young people get of German history. And I have a traveling exhibition, and I've created resources to work with school teachers. And I think that that's a fruitful way, because I think you will find that there will be teachers who do want to challenge the students, who want to show a different perspective, not just about German history, but I think introducing to Black German studies changes the whole notion of what European history is and the history of their own national states. I know that a lot of the young people that I've worked with in schools were frankly amazed to find out that there were Black populations who didn't have English as their first language. So I think it really, schools is a good route to maybe see if you can find teachers who are interested in diversifying their curriculum.
That's absolutely right. And I can see that people are starting to go because of other Zoom meetings and so on. And I'm aware that we're pushing up against our time. And I thought maybe we could finish if each of the panelists could maybe make one suggestion of the sort of like, if there's one thing you could look at, read, watch, doesn't have to be an academic monograph, but could be an academic monograph or an article or a film or a poem or something. If there's just one thing to have a look at that would just be interesting given the whole context of everything that we're talking about, the politics of academia, historiographic contributions, teaching, and so all of that, right? Just one thing that people could go and look at. What might you suggest? If anything along those lines off the top of your head? Yeah, Robbie?
I had the great fortune to be in contact with Theodor Vonya Michael over really the last decade. And he was so inspirational as a person. He was so free and giving with his information and his stories. If there's one single thing that I could suggest in English, it would be his autobiography. It is an incredible story. I think he plays down a lot of the stories, but it is absolutely inspiring. So if anyone was looking for a place to start, I would start with his autobiography. It's fantastic.
Anyone else have an idea? Kira?
I mean, there are so many places to start. I feel like I'm going to give a perhaps less traditional answer or something like that. And it's also selfish because this is what I'm interested in the future, which is a painting by Edgar Degas from 1879 called Miss Lala. at the circus. And it's a woman, she was born in part of what was formerly East Prussia. Her father was, we don't know, he's Black, African. I still need to look this up. Mother, a white German / white Polish woman. And she sort of becomes this part of the circus and gets painted by Edgar Degas. So she's born in the 1850s. And what I love about thinking about her is how much she defies our narratives of German history and colonialism and everything. Like, who was this woman born in the 1850s who sort of ends up becoming part of this this world of the circus and getting painted by Degas. So the reason why I suggest it as well is it demonstrates that there's no time period and no century when we can't think about Black lives in German history.
Go ahead, Philipp.
All right, and one random thing that I would suggest, just because it just came up, is a documentary film about Charlie Graf, and I think it's called Charlie Graf, ein Deutscher Boxer. It's about the former German boxing champion, Charlie Graf, a Black German who grew up in Mannheim in roughly in the 1970s, beginning 1970s. That's when he had his first big fights, and then sort of like slipped slowly into the red light districts, into pretty much got on the wrong path. Ended up in prison for a couple of years. I mean, it's a really interesting documentary. But what fascinates me about it is the early footage of him and his friends in Mannheim in the 1970s. And you see these interactions with his friends, all Black people, like big afros, leather jackets. You know, they talk to each other about what happened on the train. You know, this lady just came up to them. They were so completely amazed that they spoke German, and they do that in Mannheimerisch. You know, and it's so beautiful. Plus, it completely integrates this the Black GI scene of that time, because Mannheim was also like a big stammer for the U.S. Army, so it integrates that too. So it's this big overlap of like Black early 70s Black GI, Black Power kind of thing, plus this Black German trying to fit in this society. Plus, it all perfectly fits together and falls apart so easily. So Charlie Graf, ein Deutscher Boxer. Yeah, and you will find it on YouTube. Actually, let me find the link and put it in here. So easy.
It'd be very helpful. Thanks, Philipp. Tiffany, do you have something?
Yeah, I think it's an oldie but a goodie. Fabekennen, which in English is Showing Our Colors, which was published in 1992 from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I say that because every time I return to it, I learn something new. And I discover something new. And I mean, I've now had this book for like over 15 years, and it's like so weathered and worn. But I think it's a great diasporic intervention. It's a great feminist intervention, and it's a great epistemic intervention because it's literally creating new knowledge for larger audiences. So I think I think it's a great book. And I love that it basically queers genres. Like it has poetry, it has interviews, it has essays, sociological essays, historical essays, and that sort of, you know, it's sort of my MA research, but it's also sort of Katharina and my conducting interviews with many of these, you know, older Black German women. So as a source, it's so rich, and you get literally a chronology of, you know, the African diaspora in the German context. And so I think it's a useful book to sort of learn. And I think it really queers knowledge too in interesting ways. So I think that's my recommendation. And I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. And a great place to finish as well, because it's such an important foundational work. Not sufficient to cover the entirety of all of it, obviously, but what a good starting point for thinking about these themes and then following them up with other examples like have been suggested. So I see all the thank yous as everyone is preparing to go. So let me just say thank you to the panelists for all of your contributions. Thank you to Katrine as well for organizing and doing all the work behind the scenes. And also thank you to everyone who's been here. It's been phenomenal to have this sort of attention and interest and to have such great questions. Apologies for any questions we didn't get to in the time that we have. But I hope that you will continue to explore these questions, and feel free to get in touch with us if you have more questions or want to talk more about how to do the sorts of things we've talked about. Katrine, do you want to say anything in closing?
Yes, I just wanted to thank the panel again for these really interesting conversations that we had tonight. I learned so much. I see from the comments that the attendants also really appreciated and learned a lot from it. So thank you for making yourselves available. Thank you for following the invitation. It's been a real pleasure and a great way to start our seminar series. So anyone who's interested to come on to our future events, please do so. You can sign up via the website. And otherwise, all that's left to say is, have a good rest of the evening if you're in Europe, a good rest of the day if you are stateside. And thank you very, very much, everyone.